The dawn that broke over Wendling Airfield on April 29, 1944, was the kind of pale, indifferent light that made seasoned airmen uneasy, a washed-out English sky that offered no promises, only the quiet certainty that somewhere beyond the channel the Luftwaffe was waiting. In the cold stillness before engine start, the crew of the B-24 Liberator Calamity Jane moved through their pre-flight ritual with the calm precision of men who understood exactly how thin the line between life and death would be in the hours ahead. The bomber sat on the hard stand like a crouched animal, its long Davis wings stretching outward, its turrets glinting with dew. The big four-engine Liberator was a contradiction of shapes: slab-sided fuselage, slender wings built for range, a deep belly that could swallow a lethal bomb load. But today, its deadliest gift was not the bombs in its bay. It was the ring of .50 caliber guns guarding every angle of approach. The men who operated them were already inside, checking feed chutes, running gloved fingers across cold charging handles, clearing frost from turret glass. They knew the mission would take them deep into German airspace, where the factories feeding the Reich's war machine still resisted the endless hammering of the 8th Air Force. For months now, daylight bombing raids had grown deadlier as the Luftwaffe focused its remaining fighter strength on defense of the fatherland. Every crewman had heard the stories, the ones who made it home with half a rudder, the ones who limped back on two engines, the ones who never came back at all. And looming behind every whispered account was the hard truth that 29 April fell in the heart of the brutal spring battles of 1944 when Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 11, and 26 threw their Bf-109s and FW-190s at the bomber streams with a ferocity that felt almost desperate. Calamity Jane belonged to the 392nd Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, stationed here at Wendling, Norfolk. Its painted nose art, cheeky, bold, the kind of swagger the crews needed, stood in stark contrast to the tension in the faces of the men climbing aboard. Pilot First Lieutenant Harold Dixon settled into his seat, glancing at the mission folder clipped beside the throttles. The target for the day, industrial facilities deep within central Germany, was heavily defended by radar-directed flak, and among the last strongholds where the Luftwaffe still mounted coordinated fighter resistance. The briefing officers had warned them: expect aggressive interception, expect multiple attack passes, expect the enemy to come in packs. Tail gunner Bob Skelly buckled himself into his turret, surrounded by the cold metal cradle of the Liberator's last line of defense. He checked the arcs of his guns, imagining the angles from which fighters would come: 6 o'clock high, 6 o'clock low, climbing, diving, always probing for the blind spot that simply did not exist on a Liberator arranged in combat formation. The waist gunners Harris on the left, Donnelly on the right, ran ammunition belts along the floor, linking them into the feed trays. Their guns pointed outward into the gray morning, silent now, soon to roar. In the nose turret, gunner Charlie Hayes adjusted his sight ring and tested the transverse. Behind him, the bombardier and navigator plotted their initial headings. Above them, in the top turret, Staff Sergeant Marshall rotated the heavy twin .50s in smooth arcs, feeling the motors hum beneath his hands. He didn't know it yet, but before the day ended, his guns would change the course of an entire air battle. At 0630, the ground trembled as the first engines fired. A ripple of sound rolled across the airfield as dozens of R-1830 twin Wasps barked, caught, and settled into a steady growl. The Liberators of the 392nd began taxiing, lumbering into line like great armored beasts leaving their lair. As Calamity Jane joined the procession, the crew inside felt the familiar tightening that came before every mission. Not fear exactly, but a sharpened awareness, a sense that for the next 8 to 10 hours, every sound, every vibration, every flicker in the sky could mean life or death. Wheels left the runway, altitude climbed, England fell away beneath them, and ahead, stretching toward the pale horizon, the bomber stream formed. Dozens, then hundreds of Liberators and flying fortresses pulling into their staggered combat boxes. The tight box formation was not beautiful, it was not elegant, but it was lethal. Each bomber's guns overlapped with the next, creating a fortress of interlocking fire so dense that Luftwaffe pilots had begun calling it the Wall. The deeper they flew into Europe, the more critical that wall would become. As they crossed the Dutch coast, the first black blooms of heavy flak erupted beneath them, slow, ugly flowers of smoke and steel clawing at the formation. The Liberator shuddered as shockwaves rolled across its wings. The crew stayed silent except for clipped intercom reports. Flak, 5 o'clock low, hold steady, Watch for fighters. And somewhere above the thinning clouds, out of sight but closing fast, the Luftwaffe scrambled. Bf-109s and FW-190s climbed to intercept, their pilots angry, exhausted, and still deadly. They had seen bomber streams before, but not this one, not this formation, not this ship. None of them knew yet that in just a short while, one B-24 named Calamity Jane would stand almost alone against multiple attack waves and do what no one expected: destroy 5 German fighters in a single battle. But for now, the bomber droned eastward, engine steady, guns ready, crew focused, all of them flying straight into the throat of fire.
The deeper Calamity Jane pushed into the continent on the morning of April 29, 1944. The more the air seemed to tighten around the bomber stream, as if Germany itself were bracing for the blow. Below the clouds, the quilt of Dutch farmlands gave way to denser rail lines, industrial stacks, and the angular shadows of flak towers guarding the approaches to the Reich. Inside the Liberator, every man felt the shift, the point where a mission stopped being a flight and became a fight. The intercom crackled with small, controlled bursts of chatter, the kind that masked nerves with professionalism. Top turret scanning high left. Nose turret sees contrails at 1 o'clock. Waist guns loaded, checking feed. Pilot Harold Dixon kept his eyes locked on the formation leader, making sure Calamity Jane held perfect position in the tight box. Left element, low stagger, slotting into the defensive geometry that turned dozens of B-24s into a single organism of steel and fire. The strength of a tight box formation wasn't beauty, it was mathematics. At 20,000 feet, the overlapping cones of .5 caliber fire turned the sky around the bombers into a crucible. If a German fighter approached one Liberator, it approached all of them. But the formation had a weakness too. It was rigid. Break position, and you exposed the entire group to attack. Dixon knew that better than anyone. The entire crew did. And today, discipline would be the only thing that kept them alive. As they crossed into Western Germany, flak intensified. The first bursts were probing, long-range shots from batteries that had not yet zeroed in. But soon, the explosions pulsed with deadly accuracy. Shells burst so close that the shockwaves rattled the Davis wings of Calamity Jane, shaking the metal skin like a drum. The bomber shuddered as fragments clattered against its underside. In the nose turret, Charlie Hayes tracked the black clouds, watching for the telltale white specks of incoming fighters. "Pilot, Bombardier here. Heavy flak ahead, adjusting track." "Copy," Dixon replied, keeping his voice level despite the growing storm. To their right, a B-24 from another squadron took a direct hit in the wing root. The explosion ripped through its fuel tanks, turning the aircraft into a roiling ball of flame. A streak of black smoke marked the arc of its fall, as parachutes, tiny white petals, unfolded behind it. The man aboard Calamity Jane watched in silence. There was nothing to say. Losing a bomber early in a mission was common. Losing one before the fighters arrived was a bad omen. By 10:30 a.m., the formation approached one of the well-defended corridors leading toward the industrial heart of Germany. Below them lay rail yards, factories, and the kind of hardened infrastructure the Allies were determined to break before D-Day. Every mile meant heavier flak and higher odds that the Luftwaffe would pounce. The first sign of German fighters came not from sight, but from sound. A sharp, tense call from the top turret. "Fighters, high at 1 o'clock. Multiple. Looks like 109s. Staff Sergeant Marshall's voice carried the unmistakable edge of experience. He had seen enough intercepts to recognize the climb angle and formation spacing. Within seconds, the nose turret confirmed. "Visual on 10-plus bogies closing fast." Dixon tightened his grip on the yoke. This was the moment they all knew was coming. The Luftwaffe wasn't broken yet, not in April 1944. Despite crippling fuel shortages and the relentless attrition of the previous months, German fighter groups still rose in force to protect the Reich. Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 3 were known to operate in this region, and both were filled with veterans who had survived the brutal air battles of 1943. These were not green pilots. They would attack with precision and aggression. The German fighters approached from altitude, sliding down through thin cirrus clouds like dark arrows. their silhouettes sharpened against the sun. Sleek BF-109Gs and heavier, radial-engined FW-190As. They were not coming for a probing pass. This was a committed attack run. "They're splitting," Marshall called. "3 high right, 4 low left, more coming around 6 o'clock." It was a coordinated strike, a classic Luftwaffe tactic. Divide the bomber's attention, overwhelm the defensive guns, isolate a target. And Calamity Jane, despite being buried within the formation, was about to become one of those targets. Dixon steadied the bomber. "Hold formation. Gunners, get ready." The intercom became a flurry of controlled violence. "Tail turret sighting 4 aircraft, closing fast. Ball turret tracking low 6, range 3,000. Waist guns ready, 2 fighters moving through low right." The bombers held course. The fighters committed. The sky narrowed into a tunnel of danger. Then the first attack hit. A trio of FW-190s slashed through the formation from 130 high, cannons spitting fire. Tracers stitched the air around Calamity Jane, smashing into the fuselage like the sound of sledgehammers hitting steel. One engine shuddered. A waist window shattered. The intercom erupted with "Incoming 6 o'clock low, fast," as the second wave dove upward into the belly of the group. The bombers responded instantly. Guns roared in every direction. .5 caliber shells streaked across the sky, forming the interlocking defensive lattice the Germans hated. Fighters wove, dodged, climbed, dove, and through the chaos, something else began to take shape. The sense that the Luftwaffe had underestimated this formation, underestimated these gunners, underestimated this one B-24. The first fighter kill hadn't happened yet, but the moment the Germans attacked, the battle that would shock them, the one where Calamity Jane destroyed 5 fighters in a single engagement, had already begun. The storm was here.
The first fighter came in like a thrown spear, an FW-190A, diving out of the sun at nearly 400 miles an hour, its radial engine screaming, and its 20mm cannons flashing bright white bursts that stitched chaos into the formation. The rounds hammered across Calamity Jane's left wing, tearing through aluminum skin and leaving jagged scars that hissed in the slipstream. Inside the bomber, no one flinched. This was what they trained for. This was the moment they lived or died by. "FW coming down 1 o'clock high," Staff Sergeant Marshall roared from the top turret, already swinging his guns into position. Before the fighter even completed its pass, Marshall squeezed the triggers. The twin 50s thundered, hard, violent kicks that shook the turret ring as empty brass clattered down the fuselage floor like falling hail. Tracers arced upward, bright spears cutting against the sky. The first burst crossed behind the fighter. The second walked forward. The third found the mark. The FW-190 jerked violently, a wing snapping upward as holes punched through the canopy. A split second later, it rolled onto its back, trailing black smoke, tumbling end over end until it vanished behind the other bombers. "One down!" someone yelled, but the moment of triumph lasted less than a heartbeat. "6 o'clock! Multiple bandits!" Skelly shouted from the tail turret. "Closing fast! Low!" 3 fighters, 2 FW-190s and a BF-109 rose from beneath the bomber stream, engines growling as they aimed directly at the belly of the 392nd formation. It was the most dangerous angle for the Liberators, the blind spot between the waist guns and the tail turret, where only the ball turret had a clear shot. Down below, suspended in a metal sphere barely wider than a coffin, ball turret gunner David Shorty Klein rotated his bubble into position. His world shrank to the curve of a gun sight and the oncoming shapes of fighters racing toward him head-on. "Ball turret engaging," he said through clenched teeth. The first FW-190 opened fire, its cannons flashing. Shells ripped upward, punching holes through the belly of the B-24, sending insulation and torn metal fluttering through the fuselage. But Klein held the triggers down. His 50 spat fire, tracers converging on the German fighter. The rounds smashed into the engine cowling, then the cockpit. The FW-190 shuddered, and then erupted in a fireball that lit Klein's turret like a flare. Skelly saw the second FW-190 swinging wide, trying to cut behind the tail. He didn't wait. He fired a long burst that stitched across the fighter's fuselage. The German pilot tried to climb, but the tail turret's guns followed him relentlessly. The fighter rolled hard right,
smoke pouring from its wing root, and plunged downward until it disappeared in the clouds. "That's two for tail," Skelly shouted. "Keep 'em coming!" The formation was now under full assault. A pair of BF-109s dove through the top of the combat box, cannon fire spraying across the upper Liberators. One bomber from a neighboring squadron took direct hits and began to fall, trailing flame. But the tight box held firm. Every turret, every gun, every angle erupted in fire. Calamity Jane was now the center of a swirling melee, German fighters weaving through the formation, dodging curtains of tracers as they searched for a chink in the defenses. They found none. A BF-109 dove from 7 o'clock high, angling for the waist section. Don lay on the right waist, swung his gun upward, tracking the fighter as it flashed between bombers. "Right waist engaging!" He fired. The first burst missed. The second clipped the wingtip. The third ripped across the fuselage. The BF-109 exploded in a spray of flames and debris, breaking apart mid-air before its wreckage spiraled toward the fields below. Four enemy fighters gone, and the battle was far from over. The last kill, the fifth and final one that would etch Calamity Jane into 8th Air Force history, came in the most desperate moment of the fight. A lone FW-190, perhaps a veteran judging by his precision, dove through the hail of defensive fire and lined up directly behind Calamity Jane, sitting perfectly in the tail gun's blind spot. For 3 agonizing seconds, the German pilot had a clean shot. "Can't depress!" Skelly shouted, struggling to bring his guns down far enough. The FW-190 opened fire, 20mm rounds ripped into the lower fuselage, one burst shattered the oxygen system, another tore through the flooring behind the tail turret. The bomber shuddered, dropping 100 feet in the formation. But in that same drop, that same violent shake, the angle changed. Skelly's guns clicked into range. He pressed the triggers, the 50 calibers roared, muzzle flashes lighting the turret glass. The rounds hit the FW-190 head-on. One burst shattered the prop spinner, another punched through the cockpit. The FW-190 shuddered and then erupted in a fireball that lit Klein's turret like a flare. "Fifth bandit destroyed!" the navigator shouted, voice cracking with disbelieving triumph. Silence followed, brief, fragile, shaking. 5 kills, 1 B-24, 1 battle. The Luftwaffe pilots, stunned at the ferocity of the defense, began to peel away, regrouping out of range of the bomber guns. For the first time since the attack began, the formation had breathing room. Calamity Jane was bleeding, holes torn through her skin, one engine coughing smoke, the ball turret jammed from debris. But she was still in formation, still flying straight, still alive. And she had just done what no one thought possible, stood her ground against a coordinated Luftwaffe assault and destroyed 5 fighters in a single engagement. The sky around her was suddenly impossibly quiet. But the battle was not over. The hardest part, getting home, was yet to begin.
Smoke leaked through the seams in the fuselage like thin gray fingers, twisting through the cold air inside Calamity Jane as the bomber shuddered, struggling to hold altitude. Every man on board felt the tremors, deep, uneven vibrations that told them the airframe had taken more punishment than anyone had yet had time to assess. The intercom hissed with static, then crackled to life with the strained voice of engineer Roy Daniels. "Engine 3's running rough, oil pressure dropping, she's hit hard." Dixon steadied the yoke, feeling the Liberator fight him, sluggish on the right side where cannon shells had chewed into the cowling. "Feather it if she goes," he said, "but keep her turning as long as we can." Behind him, the navigator wiped blood from his forehead, the result of a fragment that had burst through the overhead panel, and tried to read a map smudged with sweat and soot. The waist gunner stepped over spent shell casings ankle deep, the smell of burnt powder thick in the air. Light poured through fist-sized holes in the fuselage where cannon rounds had punched clean through, each opening fringed with curled metal. Waist gunner Donnelly leaned toward the starboard window, scanning the sky for more fighters. "Clear right," he said, voice shaky. "Clear for now." But no one believed the danger was gone. The Luftwaffe almost always returned for a second strike after the bombers had been bloodied and disoriented. The formation around them had tightened, trying to cover the gaps left by the aircraft that had gone down. One B-24 had exploded in mid-air minutes earlier, its debris still drifting toward the fields below. Another had peeled away, trailing smoke, losing altitude with grim inevitability. Calamity Jane had survived the first assault, but she was wounded, and wounded aircraft drew predators. Skelly rotated his tail turret, watching the horizon with predatory focus. 6 o'clock clear, he reported, but they'll be back. They always come back. Up front, the top turret had gone silent. Marshall was cycling his guns, checking for fouling. Heat had warped the barrels, and the turret's rotation felt sluggish after the pounding it had taken. Below them, in the ball turret, Klein tried to move, but nothing happened. The turret was jammed halfway through its last rotation, locked in place by metal fragments that had wedged themselves between the gears. "Ball turret stuck," Klein said. "Can't traverse, can't elevate." The words hit the crew like a gut punch. A frozen turret meant a blind lower rear sector, an invitation for any German pilot who noticed. Dixon kept his voice calm. "Stay alert. The formation will cover us." But even he knew the formation was thinner now. The bomber stream had taken losses, and the Luftwaffe still had strength left to throw at them. As the bombers turned toward home, the flak returned. Thick, accurate, murderous. Black bursts erupted all around them as the German gunners recalibrated their aim. "Flak heavy, 11 o'clock low," Hayes called from the nose turret. "They're walking it up on us." The air shook again and again as near misses slammed shockwaves through the Davis wings. One blast hit so close the bomber lurched sideways, throwing the waist gunners into the bulkhead. A shard of flak punched through the fuselage and lodged itself in the radio operator's table, quivering like an arrow. Despite the punishment, Calamity Jane held formation. That was rule number 1. Stay with the group. A lone bomber was a dead bomber. Dixon trimmed the plane, fighting the drag from the damaged engine and the shredded sections of fuselage. The controls felt heavier now, like someone had tied weights to the wings. But the Davis wing, graceful, long, efficient, still produced enough lift to keep the bomber aloft despite the wounds. "Pilot, engine 3's dropping to critical oil pressure. She's gonna seize." Dixon exhaled, steady and slow. Feather 3. The engineer hit the switch. The propeller spun down, then locked into place. The sudden loss of thrust yawed the bomber violently to the right. Dixon fought it, muscles straining, sweat stinging his eyes. "Hold! Hold! Okay, trim it out." Slowly, painfully, Calamity Jane stabilized, but the price was steep. One engine gone, one more damaged, extraction becoming harder by the mile. "Fighters," Skelly shouted. 3 o'clock high, coming around the right side." A fresh flight of Bf-109s cut across the sun, diving toward the wounded bombers. The formation erupted in fire again, tracers arcing upward in desperate overlapping streams. Dixon's heart hammered. If they hit now, when the bomber limped through the sky and one turret was dead, they'd finish the job. The fighters swept in, but escorts flashed in from above. P-51 Mustangs, sleek, silver, hungry, pounced on the Germans with savage precision. The sky became a swirl of turning, clawing machines. "They've got 'em," Hayes shouted. "Escorts are on them." And just like that, the threat began to peel away. One by one, the German fighters disengaged, slashing downward, dropping out of the fight as the Mustangs forced them to defend themselves. The bomber stream exhaled collectively as the pressure eased. The Luftwaffe was retreating, out of fuel, out of fighters, out of time. Calamity Jane kept flying, wounded, bleeding, shaking, but flying. As they crossed back over the North Sea hours later, Dixon saw the English coastline rise like salvation from the mist. When the wheels finally hit the runway at Wendling, the bomber sagged heavily, rolling to a stop with smoke drifting from its wounds. Ground crews stared in open astonishment. There were holes everywhere, hundreds of them. The fuselage looked like it had been raped by claws. A section of the right wingtip was gone. The ball turret was jammed solid. Engine 3 was nearly seized. But inside, shaken and exhausted, the crew was alive. Against the odds, against the storm, Calamity Jane had refused to fall. And no one yet realized just how extraordinary their battle report would prove to be.
The debriefing room at Wendling was cramped, smoke-filled, and far too warm for a crew that had just crawled out of a battered metal coffin. Jackets lay half unzipped, faces were streaked with dried sweat and soot, and hands still trembled from adrenaline overload. No one spoke at first. They simply sat, breathing, recovering, processing the impossible fact that they were alive. Intelligence officers spread out the standardized combat report sheets, the ones every crew filled after every mission, each line a quiet record of chaos. But this time, the officers paused as they reached Calamity Jane. The bomber looked like it shouldn't have made it home, and the crew's expressions, drained, hollowed out, distant, made it clear this mission had been unlike anything they had survived before. Lieutenant Dixon finally began. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw by oxygen mask dryness and hours of tension. We took heavy fighter resistance southwest of the IT, approximately 10 to 12 aircraft in the first wave. Coordinated attack, multiple approaches, 1 to 130 high, several from 6 low, 3 low right. The intelligence officer nodded, pen scratching across the paper. Nothing unusual yet. Every bomber group in 8th Air Force had faced similar attacks during the spring of '44, the season Allied crews grimly called the meat grinder. But then Dixon paused, looked at his crew and added, "Confirmed, 5 enemy aircraft destroyed by our ship." The pen stopped. The room went still. 5? The officer repeated. 5 fighters? From 1 Liberator? Dixon nodded. The gunners added detail. Marshall explaining his high-angle kill from the top turret. Klein describing the ball turret engagement that lit up the belly of the sky. Skelly recounting the 2 FW-190s he dropped at 6 o'clock, one in the most dangerous tail chase imaginable. Donnelly describing the BF-109 that crossed between 2 bombers and flew directly into his line of fire. The officer wrote slower now, glancing up repeatedly as if expecting someone to take it back. But the accounts matched. The timing matched. The angles matched. The formation's broader report, filed by other crews from the 392nd, confirmed the kills independently. Over the next hours, the combat analysts reviewed every testimony, cross-referenced every tracer stream observed from neighboring B-24s, and compared every moment of the dogfight. The conclusion was unavoidable. Calamity Jane had shot down 5 enemy fighters in a single engagement. A handful of bombers during the war had done the same, some B-17s in the worst months of 1943, a Liberator in the Pacific, but it remained one of the rarest feats in all of heavy bomber combat. And what made the achievement even more extraordinary was the condition of the aircraft. Damage assessors walked around the Liberator that afternoon, clipboards shaking slightly in their hands. Over 100 holes peppered the fuselage. Engine 3 was nearly dead. Hydraulic lines were shredded. Several ribs in the right wing were cracked. The entire lower belly looked as though it had been clawed open. Yet the Davis wing kept the bomber airborne. The engines kept what power they could, and the crew held the aircraft steady. It had been, by every measure, a miracle of design and willpower. That evening, the formal report traveled through 392nd Bomb Group headquarters, then up the chain to the 14th Combat Wing, then into the hands of senior analysts in the 8th Air Force. There, the story spread across briefing rooms like wildfire. 5 kills from a single bomber against coordinated attacks by experienced Jagdgeschwader pilots after taking catastrophic damage? It didn't seem real, but it was. In Germany, the Luftwaffe pilots who had survived the engagement filed their own mission reports. They noted the intensity of the returning fire, the difficulty of penetrating the combat box, and the shocking accuracy of certain turrets, especially one B-24, deep in the formation that responded with immediate, precise fire from multiple directions. One German pilot reportedly wrote, "It was as if the bomber was surrounded by guns on every angle, impossible to close without taking hits." That was the reputation tight box formations earned during the spring of '44, but Calamity Jane became the example everyone remembered. Meanwhile, back at Wendling, ground crews patched the bomber through the night. Mechanics riveted new skin over the shredded metal. Armorers replaced bent barrels. Electricians rewired turret relays and oxygen lines. It took days to make the Liberator airworthy again. When it finally rolled out of the hangar, its fresh aluminum patches gleamed like battle scars, mute testimony to the nightmare it had survived. For the men who flew her, The legacy of that mission would linger long after the war. Dixon carried the memory of holding the bomber steady while his crew fought for their lives behind him. Marshall would never forget the flash of the first FW-190 bursting apart under his guns. Klein, trapped in the ball turret as cannon shells crawled upward toward him, would remember the moment his 50s found their mark in the blinding light of an exploding fighter. Skelly, whose last-second angle adjustment saved the bomber from annihilation, later told a fellow gunner, "That last one, I don't know how we're still here after that." The event changed the way the group viewed their aircraft. Liberators were known as fast, long-range, rugged, maybe less romantic than the Flying Fortresses, but that day reminded everyone that a B-24 with disciplined gunners and a crew that trusted each other could become a flying fortress of its own. Strategically, the mission marked another turning point in the air war over Germany. By late April 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. Every destroyed fighter mattered. Every lost ace hurt. Every kill pushed the Reich further toward the breaking point. Calamity Jane had taken 5, and it had done so not with pursuit tactics or agility, but through the brutal efficiency of American defensive firepower. In the sky that spring, a weapon Germany could no longer afford to face. By the summer, Allied fighters would dominate the skies so thoroughly that bomber crews would often only see fleeting resistance. The Luftwaffe would not recover. And somewhere in the thousands of pages of combat archives, in the dense black ink of 8th Air Force records, one entry stands out still. B-24 Calamity Jane, 392nd Bomb Group. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission. Returned to base despite severe battle damage. Crew unharmed. In the end, the story became something more than numbers. It became a reminder of what heavy bombers truly were at their core. Not machines, but teams. Men bound together by steel and fate and fire. On that day above Germany, one of those teams stood their ground, and the Luftwaffe never forgot it.